Hello everyone, welcome to lesson 14 on Macbeth. Today we're focusing on the character of Banquo and we're going to be tracking his development throughout the play. Now, if you haven't completed lesson 11 on Act 1 Scene 3, then you're going to need to stop this video now, go back and complete that before accessing today's lesson. Otherwise you're going to find all of this rather confusing. So for those of you who struggle to detach yourselves from your gaming chair for longer than 15 minutes, you may want to make use of the timestamps that guide you to different parts of today's lesson, and you'll find those in the description under the video. Okay, on with the show. As you can see, today's title is Tracking Banquo's Development. We might wonder why we're focusing on Banquo. Well, Banquo is a key character in Macbeth. He's also a character that hasn't come up in previous years in the exams. So the theme of the supernatural, or the character of the witches, and the character of Banquo haven't come up in the last 3 years worth of exams. So there's every chance that they could come up in next year's GCSE papers. As always, you're going to need your Macbeth notebook or file. And for today, you're going to need a copy of both the Banquo scenes and key quote sheets, and also the Banquo tracker grid, both of which are attached on Show My Homework. Hopefully you'll be able to print those out, but if not, open them up as like a live document on your screen and work on them as you're watching the video. As a do now activity, I've put a bunch of sentences up on the board. Some of them are fairly easy to complete, some of them are a bit more challenging, but if you just pause the video and give yourself 5 minutes, maybe using some of these visual clues to copy and complete as many of these sentences as possible. We're not looking for correct answers, just ideas that revise our understanding of Banquo so far. So pause the video, 5 minutes, see what you can remember. Okay, welcome back. Hopefully you've remembered some key features of Banquo's character, and crucially you've thought about him in juxtaposition or in contrast with Macbeth, because that's one of Banquo's key roles in the play, is to kind of stand opposite or alongside Macbeth, and it reveals to the audience various different aspects of Macbeth's character based on Banquo's behaviour. One interesting fact that you might want to consider is that Banquo has 115 lines in the whole play, whereas Macbeth has 719. Now, you can make of that what you will. There are various sort of things, various conclusions that might be drawn from that. And as you'll know from the scene summaries, Banquo doesn't have too long to live in Macbeth. But we might just want to consider how many lines they have when we're considering their power and their influence. Although, as we'll find out today, that could be somewhat misleading. Okay, in today's lesson, we have a central question to answer, and that is, how does Banquo's character develop, and does his role or influence end when he is murdered? Okay, so as I just alluded to, even though he's going to die relatively soon within the play, we wonder whether his role, whether his influence on the action that follows disappears altogether, or whether it lasts throughout the play and possibly beyond. So in answering that question, we're going to read and watch Banquo's remaining contributions, tracking his character arc. If you're not sure what a character arc is, don't worry, we'll come back to that later. We're going to use the character tracker table to select quotes and explore language independently, analyse key quotes together, zooming in on some important details. We'll continue to compare Macbeth and Banquo, and then plan a response to an exam question, which is something we haven't done before, but we will do today. So that's today's lesson in a nutshell. As we've done in previous lessons that I've taught, we've got a new terminology coming into the mix. Now, some of you will be aware of these terms and therefore can update your terminology grid and say that they are terms you can explain. But if you just take a moment to pause the video, find your terminology grid that you've completed in the 3 previous lessons that I've taught, and then add these three terms in the appropriate column for you. Okay, now we've mentioned this character tracker grid that hopefully you've been able to download and print off from Show My Homework. Now, what I'm going to do in a moment is just talk you through how this might work, and we're going to complete Act 1 Scene 2 and Act 1 Scene 3 together, and then you can go and do the rest independently as the lesson develops. So we've got 3 columns with spaces in them. First one is just for you basically to make points about Banquo. So in this scene, Shakespeare presents him as, and then we're going to add a point. We're then going to add quotes and details to support our point. So point, evidence, and we're hoping to find at least 2 quotes per scene to back up what we've said about Banquo here. And then it says here we're going to highlight ripe apples. Now, what I mean by that is that when you select a quotation, you should always look for a word or a device within that quotation that you can analyse and explore further, because that shows a better understanding of language, a better understanding of writers' choices. So we will be highlighting ripe apples, and that will take us nicely to the analysis section, where we're looking at what is implied or suggested or revealed or represented, etc., by the language that Shakespeare has chosen. So, in Act 1, Scene 2, we discover that Banquo is a noble warrior, although his role in the battle is overshadowed by news of Macbeth's heroics. Now, if you think, I want to do this independently, pause the video now, and you can fill in the rest of Act 1, Scene 2 and Act 1, Scene 3 on your own. So you can pause the video and do that. If not, stick with me or come back to me in a minute and we will go back, we'll go through those things together. So evidence that Banquo is a noble warrior comes in Duncan's line, our captains Macbeth and Banquo. And I've just put a D for Duncan in brackets there, just to remind me when I come to revise the play who said that. I've selected the very short quotes, eagles and lions, which are words that the captain uses to describe Macbeth and Banquo's attitude towards the threat they face on the battlefield. And then finally, Duncan's line that both Banquo and Macbeth smack of honour. So we've got our point, we've got our evidence, and then we're going to move on to our analysis. So here we've got our captains. So again, I'm going back to the ripe apples. I'm going back to the interesting part of this quote, and I'm saying implies that both are valuable to the king, but Banquo is listed behind Macbeth and not given a new title or promotion. And then for eagles and lions, I've mentioned that this comparison to eagles and lions symbolises their predatory strength and high ranking. So I'm using some subject terminology here, comparison and symbolises, to explore Shakespeare's choices. Okay, on to Act 1, Scene 3. Again, if you want to pause the video and do that independently, you can. Otherwise, keep playing, stick with it. We know that Banquo from Act 1, Scene 3 is a cautious man who doubts the existence of the witches. And the evidence for that would be, what are these that look not like the inhabitants of the earth and yet are on it? And then if we were to analyse that, we might comment on his tone. So his tone is sceptical, and he's almost hostile towards the witches. We also learn in Act 1, Scene 3 that Banquo is jealous of the attention Macbeth is receiving. And we get evidence for that from the line, "To me you speak not, speak then to me." Now, you'll notice in the quote that I've just read out and the quote above, I've put square brackets in with an ellipsis, a dot, dot, dot in the middle. Now, that's quite a nice thing you can do when you're writing essays about characters. When there's a longer quote or a longer section of the text that you want to quote from, and you don't want to spend ages copying out that huge section of text, you can sort of edit the quote down to what you need. So I wanted "to me you speak not." I didn't want the text that came before "speak then to me," so I've just cropped it out and I've indicated that by using the square brackets and the ellipsis. So that's something you can use in your own essays. Give you plenty more time to write down your own thoughts rather than copying down Shakespeare's words. So the analysis of that, we've got the imperative, "speak then to me," suggests his frustration or growing desperation to be recognised. Now, if you're looking for higher grades, the word "or" there suggests that I'm aware of an alternative interpretation. So when he says "speak then to me," it could show frustration, anger, or growing desperation. He really is desperate to be recognised. And then we've got a final point on Act 1, Scene 3, which is that Banquo is someone who notices problems that are present or which may lie ahead and offers a warning as a result. His loyalty shows that he's a force for good. He is morally virtuous. Okay, let's find the evidence for that. We've got "our partner's wrapped," which is said twice by Banquo, speaking about Macbeth. Banquo says "to betray is in deepest consequence." And in terms of our analysis there, we might look at the repetition, which emphasises his concern that Macbeth is bewitched, because we know that "wrapped" means bewitched, transfixed. And then we've got the grave tone of this declarative implies that Banquo has a clear moral compass. So the fact here he is warning that any sort of betrayal of the king will have deep and serious consequences. He's making a declarative or a statement there that really shows that he knows the difference between right and wrong. He has a moral compass. Now that expression is one that we might use again, but if you imagine a compass with its needle, he knows the right direction to follow in terms of morality, whereas Macbeth's moral compass seems to spin all around. He doesn't have any sort of sense of morality as the play develops. So hopefully that's given you a clear idea about how we would fill in this table. This level of analysis is obviously quite advanced. We're using subject terminology, we're exploring meaning, but you can write it in note form and it gives you a really good sense of the character's development over the course of the play. This would be a fantastic revision tool so that you can come back to it in year 11 and you can really just use this one sheet to revise the whole of Banquo's character. Okay, you might notice there's a slight error here. On the sheet you've hopefully gotten downloaded, the arrow that's here on the screen is actually should be pointing at this box here. And that's, again, for people aiming at grade 7, 8 and 9, you're going to want to recognise that characters change over the course of the play. So where appropriate, when you're going to describe them, you might use adverbs like increasingly, decreasingly, consistently, etc. to really get a clear sense of how the character is developing. So in Banquo's case, we might say that throughout the play, he's consistently admirable. Now that shows your ability to analyse structure, which is a difficult but worthwhile skill to be able to show. And it also shows that you can evaluate the text. And as I've said in previous videos, the ability to evaluate is in the top band of the mark scheme. So this is just a little trick you can use to show that you are really understanding a character's development as the play goes on. Right, what you'll want to do now is pause the video for a longer period, access the scenes that Banquo features in the rest of the play on the document that was on Show My Homework. Each scene is featuring a description, a summary of what happens in the scene, and then is followed by some of the lines from those scenes that I've just cut out. I've made them shorter so you don't have to read the entire scene or each of the entire scenes that Banquo is involved in. So you'll want to pause the video. You're going to want to find those scene summaries and those scene quotations and use that information to fill out the rest of the tracker grid. Now, in terms of proceeding with the video, you can either read a scene, do a row, and then come back to the video and carry on watching, where in the next slide I will explain what's happened in Act 1, Scene 4 and go through that scene with you. And then you can do the same thing. You can go back to Act 2, Scene 1 independently, then come back to the video where I'll do some explanation, or you can do it all yourself and then come back to my explanations at the end. That's up to you. So if you make that decision and crack on. Okay, so let's take a look at Act 1, Scene 4. In terms of what's happening, you've got Macbeth and Banquo along with Ross and Angus, who are other Thanes. They join the rest of Duncan's party. Duncan thanks them both for their part in the battle and announces that his eldest son, Malcolm, will inherit the throne from him when he dies. Duncan then says that they will visit Macbeth's castle as they travel from hence to Inverness and will celebrate there. So this scene is the beginning of the end for Duncan. When he says that Malcolm, his son, will inherit the throne, this disturbs Macbeth because he immediately realises that his ambition to become king, as promised by the witches, is going to be scuppered because Malcolm's going to get the throne as and when Duncan dies. So Macbeth is immediately kind of triggered, if you like, to start thinking and acting more violently and to do so more urgently. Now, if we're focusing on Banquo and we look at what's said, Banquo's been sidelined a little bit up to this point, but now he starts to get a bit more attention and a bit more credit because King Duncan says, "Welcome hither, I have begun to plant thee and will labour to make thee full of growing. Noble Banquo, that hast no less deserved, nor must be known no less to have done so. Let me enfold thee and hold thee to my heart." Now, if we look at a couple of details there, he's singing Banquo's praises. He recognises that Banquo is a noble man. And we've said previously that Duncan can be a bit blind, but he does recognise that Banquo is good. And he recognises here that Banquo is no less deserving than Macbeth. Now, that might be slightly contradicted by the fact that he's given Macbeth this new title. He's given him the title of Thane of Cawdor and not given it to Banquo. But Duncan does recognise that Banquo is deserving of recognition, deserving of praise. And he says, "Let me enfold thee and hold thee to my heart." Banquo is someone that he wants to keep close. Unfortunately, he also wants to keep Macbeth close, and that's what's going to lead directly to his downfall. Now, Banquo, as opposed to Macbeth, who's obviously just out for himself, Banquo is far more selfless, because his response to this praise is to say, "There, if I grow, the harvest is your own." He says, "if I grow," so he doesn't presume that he's going to develop or progress or become more powerful. But he says if he does, if his status is increased, whatever he benefits from in that sense will belong to Duncan. So he's showing his patriotic nature, and he's showing that whatever he grows, in a metaphorical sense, will be given to Duncan. He owes it all to him. And then a few lines later, notice this at this point, Macbeth and Banquo have actually left the stage. Duncan says, "True worthy Banquo, he is so full valiant." Now here he's really recognising Banquo's qualities and that he's worthy of praise and recognition, like he mentioned here. But the fact he's reflecting on that when Banquo has left the stage makes us kind of realise that he fully appreciates Banquo, and that he's having this moment of vision or moment of clarity here, where he really recognises that Banquo is the true and most worthy of the two. Unfortunately for Duncan, that's a little bit too little too late, because we know that he's already given the title Thane of Cawdor to Macbeth. So we move on. Duncan also kind of emphasises the point about Banquo's status, certainly his status as a right or morally virtuous character, in that he says he is a peerless kinsman. Now, peerless means there is no one to match you. Okay, you are unequalled. And certainly in the case of the play, from a moral point of view, Macbeth doesn't match up to Banquo. Banquo is far superior. So when Duncan says he's a peerless kinsman, we recognise, the audience recognises, that Banquo is the good man of the two. And we see that illustrated there. He's being kind of depicted as a bit of a saint. Okay, now on to Act 2, Scene 1. Remember that you're just selecting a couple of quotes from each scene to add to your grid. In terms of what's happening, we've got now the middle of the night, and this is at Macbeth's castle, and Banquo and his son Fleance are wandering around. You might wonder, why are they wandering around in the middle of the night? Well, they're clearly disturbed. If you remember back at the start of the play, the atmosphere is kind of eerie and disturbing. Everything seems a little bit disrupted. It's the same here in Act 2, Scene 1. In terms of what is said, we've got Banquo and his son Fleance, and Fleance is bearing a torch. Now, we might think about the symbolism there, in that Fleance is kind of shining a light, and he's maybe holding a torch that symbolises the light of positivity or hope for the future. So this young boy, who we know is going to be the character, according to the witch's prophecies, that ends up being king, holds hope and light, whereas Macbeth, in contrast, is full of hopelessness and darkness. And remember, we're in Macbeth's castle, so you've got this literal image of a dark, gloomy castle and these corridors where there's a small boy holding a torchlight amongst the darkness. Banquo says, "How goes the night, boy?" Fleance replies by saying, "The moon is down, I have not heard the clock." So again, we've got that kind of eerie atmosphere. And Banquo says, "And she goes down at 12. Fleance says, "I take it 'tis later, sir." Now, they're being very respectful of each other. They have a kind of quite formal relationship, if you like. But Banquo certainly feels responsibility to look after his son. So when he says, "Hold, take my sword," we've got this image here that he knows he's going to be passing some sort of baton up over to Fleance. Now, that's not they're doing the 4x100 in the Olympics. It's more to do with the fact that Banquo knows that Fleance is the one who's going to become king eventually. So when Banquo says, "Hold my sword," he's kind of passing that kind of legacy or that power onto his son, and also realizing, crucially, that Banquo is going to need a sword to protect himself, because Banquo knows by now that if Fleance is to become king, then he's going to be under threat. And Banquo also realises that that threat's probably going to come from Macbeth. Okay, Banquo continues. He says, "There's husbandry in heaven, their candles are all out. Take thee that too. A heavy summons lies like lead upon me, and yet I would not sleep. Merciful powers restrain me in the cursed thoughts that nature gives way to in repose." Now, a couple of things here. When he says their candles are all out, we kind of think again of the image of the sky, and the candles are the stars. So if all the stars are out in the sky, we've got a pitch black night, and again, that sets the mood for this murderous scene where Duncan's about to be killed. And then Banquo, we know, is more moral than Macbeth, but we know that he's only human, and we also know that he's had these promises made to him that his son will become king, he will get kings. And he says here, "Merciful powers restrain me in the cursed thoughts that nature gives way to in repose." Now, this is an interesting quote, because the merciful powers that are controlling Macbeth are supernatural powers. It's the witches that Macbeth has succumbed to. In Banquo's case, his powers, we think, are probably his powers of conscience. So C-O-N, science, conscience, knowing the difference between right and wrong. And he asks his conscience to restrain him in the cursed thoughts. So he can't sleep, and he doesn't want to sleep, partly because he's scared. He's scared for his son's safety, hence giving him the sword, and he's scared that Macbeth is a threat to his son's life. But he's also scared to sleep because he doesn't want to dream about the prospect of killing Duncan himself, because it's crossed his mind to do so. Okay, he's a good man, but he's maybe not a saint. He's just human. And it's maybe worth thinking about this idea that good men dream what bad men do. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means that a good person might well think about doing something terrible that would be beneficial to them, but they wouldn't actually do it. They just think about it. Whereas a bad man like Macbeth, they just crack on and act on that instinct to get success and fame. Okay, just after that sort of private moment between Banquo and his son, they come across Macbeth. Remember, it's the middle of the night. They're wandering around Macbeth's castle, and they're surprised that Macbeth's still awake. Banquo gives Macbeth a diamond from Duncan to thank him for an enjoyable evening. So we see here again, Duncan is misguidedly lavishing praise on Macbeth. The diamond is actually intended for Lady Macbeth, but Duncan, as we've seen before, is easily fooled and is willing to reward, in the form of a diamond, Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. It's kind of a down payment on his own murder, which is slightly mad. In terms of what's said, Macbeth comes along. We've got a servant with a torch. Notice Macbeth's not holding a torch because he doesn't hold any sort of positive light. He doesn't symbolise anything hopeful. Banquo immediately says, "Give me my sword, who's there?" So we see there that he's very wary. He feels very scared. Macbeth says, "A friend." And we wonder how genuine that idea of Macbeth being a friend to Banquo is. Banquo then replies by saying, "What, sir, not yet at rest?" So the question there implies, and the kind of slightly sarcastic "sir," I mean, Banquo will always be polite, and he'll always be polite in public, but remember, he's worried about what Macbeth's capable of by this stage. So it sounds somewhat forced, the "sir," that mark of respect, and the question shows his doubt for what Macbeth is up to. Now, later on, Macbeth talks about being unprepared. And here we've got the truth emerging from and his mask of being doing the right thing is slipping, and the truth is emerging, because Banquo has just said that the king's in bed, and the king is shut up in bed in measureless content. So he's gone to sleep very happy. And Macbeth sort of, maybe deliberately, maybe unwittingly, says being unprepared. Now, what might Duncan be unprepared for? Well, he's unprepared for the fact that Macbeth and Lady Macbeth are planning to and are about to murder him. So Macbeth, like I said, the mask is slipping, and Banquo is very suspicious. Something is up. Okay, Act 2, Scene 1 continues, and Banquo tells Macbeth that he dreamed of the three weird sisters last night, but Macbeth, the three weird sisters being the witches, of course, but Macbeth lies and says that he has not thought about them. So, again, you might want to pause these slides and read through the scene before you, and make your own notes before you listen to my ideas. That's up to you. Now, Banquo says all's well. So there's this game of cat and mouse going on here, because Banquo doesn't want to reveal that he's worried, and Macbeth doesn't want to reveal that he's about to kill Duncan. So they're kind of toying with each other here. They're not being honest. It's up to you whether you think Macbeth is the cat and Banquo the mouse, or vice versa. So Banquo says, all is well. I dreamt last night of the three weird sisters. To you, they have showed some truth. And Macbeth totally lies. I think not of them. Well, the opposite is true. He thinks about them all the time. He's obsessed with these promises that they've made him. Yet, when we can entreat an hour to serve, we would spend it in some words upon that business, if you would grant the time. So Macbeth clearly here wants to talk to Banquo about what they were promised. He wants to take Banquo's counsel. So he's kind of saying that he trusts Banquo. Whether we believe that or not is a different thing. And he's also saying that he wants to keep Banquo close. Now, why does he want to keep Banquo close? It's because he already feels paranoid about Fleance and the fact that Fleance has been promised the crown later down the line. And Banquo continues to be polite. He says, at your kindest leisure, okay, keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. And Macbeth responds by saying, if you shall cleave to my consent, now that means if you do what I want, I will make honour for you. So Macbeth already thinks he's more powerful than Banquo and is trying to control him by saying, do what I want and it will be worth your while. Banquo responds by saying, so I lose none in seeking to augment it, but still keep my bosom franchised and allegiance clear, I shall be counselled. Now he's saying here, he's being very clever here, because he's saying to Macbeth, I will listen to you. I will talk with you about our experience with the witches. But in this line here, but still keep my bosom franchised and allegiance clear, he's declaring there that he will still be loyal to Duncan. Okay, so even though Macbeth is looking to kind of win Banquo over to his side and his influence, Banquo is determined to still show his allegiance to the king and to his country. And this is where Banquo and Macbeth really start to differ and come apart. So Banquo is showing his allegiance to king and country. Okay, we're now on to Act 2, Scene 3. So you can either pause the video, do Act 2, Scene 3 on your own, or carry on and listen to me rambling on about all of the different points that Shakespeare has come up with. So, Duncan is found dead. Macbeth explains that he killed the guards out of fury, and this is all part of his cover-up plan. Macduff questions why Macbeth did this, so there's already some doubt from another morally good person, Macduff, who, of course, if you've read your scene summaries, we know ends up being the one to kill Macbeth. Meanwhile, Macbeth tries to explain his reasons, and Lady Macbeth faints. This is all an act. This is just her way of getting out of the situation and pretending that she's some weak and vulnerable woman that at any sort of mention of something as horrible as a death, the brutal death of a king especially, she just faints and has to be led off because she couldn't cope with such horrendous thoughts. So, led by Banquo, this is quite an important subclause here. The men are led by Banquo. The lords swear to investigate the murder. Now let's look at what's said. So this is all in reaction to the news that Duncan's dead. Banquo's response is this: too cruel, anywhere. Dear Duff, that's just an abbreviation of Macduff, I prithee, I pray, contradict thyself and say it is not so. So here Banquo is really showing his desperation, and the language is full of a really sad tone. This is too cruel. Say it isn't so. A few lines later, Lady Macbeth is carried out, and Banquo, having been devoed at the news, now turns into detective, because he says, "Look to the lady." Now that could just mean, "Oh, look, she's fainted. That's not good. Someone help her." But he also, the underlying meaning there is he's saying, "Look, everyone, look over at Lady Macbeth," because we know as the audience that Lady Macbeth is the one who hatched the plot and encouraged Macbeth to kill Duncan. So Banquo is again showing his kind of detective skills here and his wisdom. He continues, "And when we have our naked frailties hid that suffer in exposure, let us meet and question this most bloody piece of work." So if you did an Inspector Calls earlier this year, we've kind of got Banquo in the role of Inspector Ghoul here, in that he wants to investigate this outrage. He wants to find answers. He says, "To know it further, fears and scruples shake us." Now, scruples are feelings that prevent you from doing something that you think is morally wrong or makes you uncertain about doing it. So to have scruples is a good thing. To be unscrupulous means that you don't care. You just do it. You're not going to think about it. So fears and scruples shake us. In the great hand of God I stand. Now, we could interpret that in a couple of ways. He could be talking about Duncan there. Remember, they thought at the time that kings were appointed by God. So he's saying that I will still remain loyal to Duncan or God. But he's also saying he will stand up for what is right. So when he says I stand, he's saying that I will fight back. Okay, so at this point, Macbeth is slinking off into the shadows. Lady Macbeth has fainted and been carried out. And Banquo steps up to the plate, to use a kind of sporting metaphor. He takes on the role of leader. He takes on the role of chief investigator. And he swears to avenge Duncan's death. Because at the end of that speech, he says, "Against the undivulged pretense, I fight of treasonous malice." So he's very clear there about what he wants to do, and that's to avenge the death of Duncan. Okay, on to Act 3, Scene 1. Okay, now we're covering a lot of ground very quickly here. If we were in school in normal circumstances, we might spend a week's worth of lessons looking at the character of Banquo and looking at these scenes in a lot more depth and detail, and certainly at a slower pace. But as I've said to you before, these videos allow you to pause, they allow you to dip in and out, and the reason we have to cover Banquo just in one lesson is that there are other areas of the text to carry on with, and as you'll have noticed, the number of lessons you have as part of home learning are actually fewer than the ones that you have in school. So we've got a lot to cram in, hence the detailed exploration at a fast pace. Right, Act 3, Scene 1. What's happening? Well, Banquo, by this stage, suspects that Macbeth has played most foully to achieve the throne. We kind of knew he suspected him anyway, but now he's being very explicit about that. Lady Macbeth and Macbeth invite Banquo to a solemn supper that evening. Banquo and his son Fleance are going out riding that afternoon, but Banquo promises to return in time for the banquet. Yeah, right. What is said? So Banquo says, "Thou has it now, King Cawdor Glarms all, as the weird women promised, and, I fear, thou playedst most foully for it. Yet it was said it should not stand in thy posterity, but that myself should be the root and father of many kings. If there come truth from them, as upon thee, Macbeth, their speeches shine. Why, by the verities on thee made good, may they not be my oracles as well, and set me up in hope? But hush, no more." So, one of those oft quoted sections of the play, definitely one to get down on your key quote sheet. Banquo saying, "I fear thou playedst most foully for it." So he's saying, I know that the game you played and the action you carried out to kill Duncan was foul. It was a terrible thing. And the word played has connotations of almost Macbeth thinking that this is a game, and a game that he's going to win and kind of get away with having won by cheating. And again, with Fowley, we've got the echo back to the witch's lines at the start of the play, and also to Macbeth's first line in the play. So Banquo's really got Macbeth's number here. He knows what's what. Remember, he also is aware of the promise that he was made. Myself should be the root and father of many kings. And he's still keen to defend that possibility. And we'll come on to that in a second. But he's very conscious of Fleance and what Fleance was promised. He says, may they not be my oracles as well? So there's potential that he's still not jealous, but he's still hopeful that the prophecy that was made to him might come true. And an oracle is someone who can kind of predict the future. So he's hoping that they can be his too, and not just Macbeth's. Because I think he's acknowledging at this stage that it would be good for him, but it would also be good for Scotland if the witch's prophecies come true for him and for Fleance. And it's going to be terrible for Scotland that Macbeth has become king, having become Cawdor and Glamis and everything else. And then we get Macbeth enters. He comes in now as king, because remember, this banquet is his celebration banquet. Okay, this is where he's being toasted, having become king. And all of the, at this stage, very willing supplicant lords are all gathered round to toast the king and praise him. Okay, this is before it all goes truly wrong for Macbeth and they all smell the proverbial rat. Now, Macbeth says, here's our chief guest, speaking about Banquo, and that sounds quite ominous. That sounds quite threatening. And guest is a particularly threatening word, because if you remember, Macbeth and Lady Macbeth's previous chief guest was King Duncan, and we know what happened to him. And Lady Macbeth's language continues to be quite foreboding, quite ominous. She says, if he had been forgotten, it had been as a gap in our great feast. Now, you can imagine here a big banquet table and an empty chair. Now, again, that's foreshadowing the death of Banquo, because that death will obviously lead to there being an empty seat at the banquet table. And Macbeth says, tonight we hold a solemn supper, sir. And I've read that phrase particularly, what's the word I'm looking for? Creepily, I suppose, because there's alliteration in that, solemn supper, sir. And to be fancy, grade 8 and 9 kids, it's sibilant alliteration, because the alliteration is on the letter S. And it makes Macbeth sound not like he's got a lisp, no, like a snake. Okay, and we all know the connotations of snakes and being sly and slithering around. So Macbeth is sounding somewhat snake-like here. And when he says to Banquo, I'll request your presence, he's saying, you need to be there, because I need to kill you. Or at least I need to get someone else to kill you. And Banquo continues to be polite and kind of put on this front that he doesn't suspect Macbeth, because as soon as he shows Macbeth his hand, as soon as he shows that he does suspect Macbeth, Macbeth is likely to polish him off and get rid of Fleance as well. So Banquo is still playing this game. Let your highness command upon me. Okay, so respectful language there. To the which my duties are with a most indissoluble tie forever knit. Now, again, he's playing with language here, because on the surface, it looks like he's being very respectful towards Macbeth when he's talking about your highness, my duty, forever knit. Macbeth might be thinking, oh, he's showing his loyalty to me. But when he says indissoluble, that's something that cannot be dissolved, and he's tied to his sense of duty. He's actually talking about his sense of duty to Duncan, to Scotland, and to his son. So when he says forever knit, forever bound to, he doesn't mean he's forever bound to Macbeth. He means that he's forever bound to his king, his country, his rightful king, his country, and his son. Now, this is an image here of one stage production with Banquo's ghost having Macbeth in this kind of stranglehold. And that's kind of what's going on in this scene, in that Macbeth thinks he's in control, but Banquo knows deep down what's about to happen or to be attempted. Now, the final interpretation of my duties are with a most indissoluble tie forever knit could be foreshadowing his return as a ghost. So he's saying, he could be saying that if I do die, okay, I will always be tied or knitted to you, Macbeth. I will come back and I will haunt you. So there's that implied threat there in what he says. Right, now we get on to Act 3, Scene 3. This is the murder scene. So 3 murderers attack Banquo and Fleance. Fleance manages to escape and Banquo shouts after him, "Thou mayst revenge," and then Banquo is killed. Notice that Macbeth has employed 3 murderers to do his dirty work for him, and you can obviously have your opinions about what kind of man that makes Macbeth. In terms of what's said, now it takes place in a park or a wood near the palace. So that, again, dark, eerie setting being used by Shakespeare. Again, we've got the use of a torch. So that sign or that symbol that Banquo and Fleance are shining the torch or holding a torch for goodness, for moral virtue. Banquo says 3 things. Now, I've cut the text down here. It's not just Banquo speaking for the whole scene. But Banquo says 3 important things before he dies. "Give us a light there, ho." So that's about that idea of shining a light, both literal and metaphorical. Banquo then says, "It will be rain tonight." So again, he's kind of showing his prescience, prescience, his ability to see into the future, but not in a kind of supernatural, creepy way, just in an intellectual way. He's able to work out what's going to go on. And "it will be rain tonight" suggests that potentially people will cry. People will mourn the loss of Banquo as a good man. And later in the play, when people are mourning that they've lost Scotland to this tyrant king Macbeth, they may well look back at Banquo and remember him fondly in comparison and feel a tear coming to their eye. And Banquo's final lines are these. He says, "O treachery, fly, good Fleance, fly, fly, fly. Thou mayest revenge, O slave." So we've talked about light and rain, and the contrast maybe there is highlighted by the highlights. We might also think here that the rain falling on Scotland is Macbeth, and rain, interestingly, is a pun on reign, R-E-I-G-N, which means to rule, as a king would. You'd have the reign of a king or queen. Banquo's language here is really, you may notice, exclamatory. He's obviously panicking because he's about to be killed. He uses the word treachery. Okay, there's an act of treachery going on. He's been betrayed, and he knows who he's been betrayed by. He knows who these murderers are representing. And when he says, "Fly, good Fleance, fly, fly, fly," he's kind of setting his son free. So we've got that sense that he's doing a really selfless thing. He's sacrificing himself, okay, by sort of throwing himself into the hands of the murderers, distracting them so that Fleance can escape. And he's putting all his hopes, all his light in the hands of his son. Okay, remember "take my sword" from earlier on, from Act 2, Scene 1. And he's letting Fleance escape. Now that could be for selfish reasons, in that he knows that Fleance has been promised the crown eventually, but we probably think that it's just to show that he's a good parent and a responsible person. Now, he says here to Fleance, "Thou mayst revenge." He's almost commanding him to, or giving him permission to take revenge later on in the play. And we wonder whether that's going to happen. Now, we know within the structure of the play that Fleance himself doesn't take revenge, but Banquo's death partly is avenged by Macduff when he kills Macbeth in Act 5. And his dying words are these 2 simple words, "O slave." And we think there that's his final insult to Macbeth, because rather than recognizing him as a king and being respectful, he's actually saying that Macbeth is a slave. Now we might ask, a slave to what? Well, you can work that out. But maybe one thing that Macbeth is a slave to is the witches. Another thing could be that he's a slave to his own ambition or to his wife. So he's really undermining Macbeth here. He dies, Fleance escapes. Act 3, Scene 3, done. Okay, you may now be thinking, oh, thank God that is it. Banquo is dead. This lesson is over. Well, no, my friends, you are wrong, because Banquo's role in the play continues and potentially becomes more substantial when he's dead. Because in Act 3, Scene 4, Banquo's ghost appears. So, before we get on to Act 3, Scene 4, you might want to pause at this point and answer the questions that are up on the screen. And that's just getting you to think creatively about, or getting you to think evaluatively about what Banquo might say to Macbeth, or the ghost of Banquo might say, how you expect Macbeth to react. So a little predictions exercise here that tests your sort of your reading skills. And what do you expect Lady Macbeth to say to her husband if he seems affected by the ghost? So that's just an opportunity to think about the characters and their likely responses. Okay, so you may want to pause the video and answer those questions. Okay, now I did promise you that we would watch some of Banquo's action, some of the scenes from the play, and we are going to focus that on Act 3, Scene 4 in performance. So you're now going to watch a sort of stage/film production with Patrick Stewart, or Professor X, in the role of Macbeth. So, little word of warning here for people that are easily freaked out. This is a little bit disturbing, but carry on.
Which of you have done this? Thou canst not say I did it! Never shake thy gory locks at me! Gentlemen, rise. His Highness is not well.
Sit, worthy friends. My lord is often thus, and hath been from his youth. Pray you, keep seat. If it is momentary, upon a thought he will again be well. If much you note him, you will offend him and extend his passion. Feed, and regard him not. Are you a man?
I am a bold one. The dare look on that might have fallen the devil.
Proper stuff. This is the very thing of your fear. This is the air-drawn dagger that you said led you to Duncan. Flaws and starts and posters to true fear would well become a woman's story that would disfire authorized by her grand and shame itself. Why do you make such faces? When all's done, you look but on the air.
Really? See there. Behold. Look! Lo! Huh? How say you? Why, what care I? If thou canst nod, speak too! If charnel houses and our graves must send those we bury back, why then our monuments will be the walls of kites!
Are you quite unmanned in folly?
If I stand here, I saw him.
By the shame!
Blood hath been shed in the olden times. And since 2 murders have been performed, too terrible for the ear. The times have been that when the brains were out, a man would die, and there an end. But now they rise again with 20 mortal murders on their crown, and push us from our stools. This is more strange than such a murder is.
My royal lord, your noble friends do lack you.
I do forget. Do not muse at me, my most worthy friends. I have a strange infirmity, which is nothing to those that know me. Now, love and health to all. Then I'll sit down, give me some wine, and quit my sight. Let the earth hide thee. Thy bones are marrowless. Thy blood is cold. Thou hast no speculation in those eyes which thou dost glare with.
Think of this, good peers, but as a thing of custom. It is no other. Only spoils the pleasure of the time.
What man dare? I dare. Approach thou like the rugged Russian bear, the armed rhinoceros, the Hyrcan tiger. Take any shape but that, and my firm nerves will never tremble. Or be alive again, and dare me to the desert with thy sword. If trembling I inhabit, then protest me the baby of a girl. Hence, horrible shadow, unreal mockery, hence! Being gone, I'm a man again.
Okay, so there we see Banquo's ghost returning to haunt Macbeth. Macbeth being totally freaked out by that, and for the first time, his paranoia and his insanity really becomes public. So before he's expressed his doubts and his worries in private, here it really becomes public at the banquet in front of all of the other things, which is, like we said, the sort of beginning of the end for Macbeth, because he loses that public respect, or starts to lose it at this point. Right, if you haven't yet looked at Act 3, Scene 4 and filled in that section of your tracker grid, now would be the time to pause the video and do so. If not, stick with me and I will be, if you have done it and you want to get onto the explanation or just want help with the explanation, stick with me onto the next slide. So Act 3, Scene 4, what's happening? Well, we know what's happening because we've just seen it, that the guests arrive for the coronation banquet. Macbeth sees one of the murderers arrive with blood on his face and he's pleased to hear that Banquo is dead. He is disappointed that Fleance escaped, but he reassures himself that there is no immediate threat because Fleance is so young. So, Macbeth says, then comes my fit again. So when he finds out that Fleance has escaped, this fit is this panic, okay, this worry. He says that he had been like marble or like a rock, so he had been solid and strong. But this news that Fleance has escaped is starting to create cracks in that rock. And now he's having some saucy doubts and fears. Okay, so these words cabined and cribbed and confined suggest that he's actually held prisoner by his doubts and his fears. It's madness that will end up sort of really making Macbeth suffer. And this vision of Banquo's ghost that comes up could be a hallucination as a result of that sort of descent into insanity. So we see him going mad and becoming very fearful. Now, when he says, but Banquo's safe, this is a strange use of the word safe because he means safely dead. So he's kind of in such a state of confusion, or his mind is so warped and disturbed by this point that he actually thinks that Banquo's death is a positive thing because it helps him, Macbeth, be safe and his status be safe. After the first murderer has told Macbeth that Banquo is dead in a ditch, literally, Macbeth then says, thanks for that, there the grown serpent lies. Now this is slightly odd and ironic in that earlier we were saying Macbeth sounds like a snake and is the real serpent in this play. And we can connect that back to Lady Macbeth's recommendation earlier in the play that he act like the innocent flower but be the serpent under it. But Macbeth here says, thanks for that, or thanks for killing Banquo, that's great. Just very casual about it. And then says, there the grown serpent lies. So he actually there is saying that Banquo is a snake. Banquo was the sly one who was posing a threat and who was poisonous. And then he says, the worm that's fled. Well, that's a reference to Fleance. So Fleance at the moment is a worm. He's not worried about this worm because, worms are fairly harmless. But he says that Fleance had the nature that in time will venom breed. So he's saying that Fleance at the moment is a harmless worm, but he will become a snake. He will become a poisonous snake. So this is adding to that sense that Macbeth is panicked and disturbed. So we might wonder who the snake in man's clothing is. Macbeth thinks it's Banquo, thinks it will be Fleance, but we all know really that it is Macbeth himself. Okay, Act 3, Scene 4 continues in that the banquet begins and then the ghost turns up and sits in Macbeth's place at the table. The version you just saw obviously decides to just climb all over the table, but in the original play, the ghost sits in Macbeth's place. A few more lines to digest here. So if you want to pause and read it through at your own pace, then fine. Otherwise, we will just have a look at some of the key details. Macbeth says, "Never shake thy gory locks at me." So he's still trying to be in control. He's still using imperative language. Don't ever shake your gory locks towards me. Don't ever shake your head and your hair in my direction. But he's failing. He's not able to control the situation because his mind is lost, or it's certainly on the way to being lost. So it's actually the ghost, the vision, the hallucination that's in control of the situation and comes and goes to taunt and torment Macbeth. Macbeth says, "Prithee, see there, behold, look low." And at this point, his language becomes really fragmented. Okay, Shakespeare's really breaking up the rhythm or flow of Macbeth's language. And if we were to use a bit of subject terminology, I've said fragmented, as in fragmented syntax. That basically means the sentence is broken up, becomes very fractured and broken to reflect Macbeth's state of mind. The iambic pentameter, that if you remember from an earlier lesson, is the way that noble characters speak. That's been broken too, because prithee, see there, behold, look low. Well, that's not got 5 metric feet in it. So the rhythm that Macbeth should be speaking in as a king has been broken. If you use a poetic term, we've got lots of caesura in there. Okay, it's kind of broken up. And then this exclamatory language. He's panicked, as shown by these repeated exclamation marks. He tries to dismiss it. He says, "Why? What care I?" Tries to kind of brush it off, but then tries to reassert control. "If thou canst nod, speak too." So if you remember earlier, he told the witches they had to speak, and they did. Well, here he's trying to tell Banquo, another supernatural force or an agent of the witches, to speak. But he won't. And that's much more scary for Macbeth. That silence is much more deadly and disturbing. And Macbeth increasingly panics because just to illustrate the control that the ghost has, Banquo's ghost vanishes and then a few lines later comes back. So he's really toying with Macbeth. We had the cat and mouse metaphor earlier. Well, here, Banquo is the cat and Macbeth very much is the mouse who's being played with. And Macbeth says, "Avaunt and quit my sight." He's desperate to get rid of the ghost. And he talks about the ghost having eyes which thou dost glare with. So he's feeling like the ghost is blaming him. It's making him feel very conscientious, very guilty, and he hates that. So he wants the ghost to vanish permanently. And this continues, "Hence, horrible shadow, unreal mockery, hence." He's saying, "Go, leave me, stop haunting me." And the horrible shadow is what Banquo has become. So that would be a good quote to use, that Banquo has become Macbeth's horrible shadow that he just cannot shake off. Right. If you're thinking of grade 7+, you might want to take on this challenge, which is to respond to this statement. The statement, "The encounter with Banquo's ghost will be a catalyst for Macbeth's descent into more extreme violence and or madness." So you can pause at this point and respond to that if you want. Again, just practicing those argumentative or evaluative skills. If not, move on. Now, we might think, oh, well, the ghost has been and gone. That's the end of it. Well, Banquo's legacy lasts beyond the visit of the ghost. We know that at the end of the play, Macbeth is dethroned and beheaded. So what we're doing now is kind of summing up what Banquo has left behind, his legacy. Malcolm is crowned king. So we might get the sense that because Macbeth has been purged and Duncan's son has been crowned, that everything's back to normal. Everything's actually okay again. It's as it should be. It's as it was at the start of the play. Okay, the rightful king is on the throne. But Fleance is still out there. And this is a bit of a plot twist, or potential kind of future plot twist for Macbeth, the sequel, which obviously doesn't exist, could be sort of shaped around. Because remember, Fleance escaped, and we don't hear from him or of him in the rest of the play. So we can only assume that he's still out there in the world. And therefore, if he's still out there in the world, there's still the threat or the potential, depending on your point of view, for him to become king. Now that suggests that possibly the presence of the supernatural remains, even though Malcolm's king and everything looks like it's back to normal, the evil Macbeth is gone, the supernatural is still looming. It's still hovering over the play and over life in Scotland, just like Banquo's ghost hovers over Macbeth. So the presence of the supernatural remains. And King James, watching on, might be left feeling a bit befuddled at this point, because on one hand, he's thinking, great, I've just been shown that bad guys who represent the supernatural, they ultimately fail, get beheaded, and the rightful person becomes king. So that puts me at ease. That puts my mind at rest. But then he's also reacting to the play potentially in a worried fashion, in that he knows, we might have noticed, like Macbeth notices earlier in the play, that Fleance is still there, and the supernatural therefore is still there, and that might disturb King James. And again, this is an example of Shakespeare pushing his luck a little bit and pushing the boundaries of what's acceptable and what is very controversial, because he's saying, oh, okay, who is in control? Is it God and his appointed kings on earth? Or is it actually some sort of supernatural mystical force? So there's that intrigue that is remaining after the curtain closes and the play ends. Okay, we're now on to comparing Macbeth and Banquo. Now, this is one of the 2 tasks that you have been asked today to submit to your teachers. So it's crucial that you do this. How you present it is up to you. I've gone for a Venn diagram, and all you're going to do is just put your ideas about Macbeth's character over here. So these are things that are exclusive to Macbeth. They only apply to Macbeth. Over here, you're going to put things that only apply to Banquo, and in the middle, things that they have in common. Now, you can do that. You can pause the video now and do that completely independently. If you want a bit of help, I've popped a bunch of words up there, largely adjectives, the odd noun, that you can organise into Macbeth, Banquo, or both. So if you need some support, pause the video now, create your comparative table or Venn diagram, and then I'll come back in a minute and I'll go through what you might have included in those sections so that you've got a really quality piece of work to submit to your teachers later on. Okay, let's go through what you might have included in your comparative table. These are very much opinionated. As long as you've got evidence to back them up, you can put them wherever you think is appropriate. But I'll just run through it quickly just to help you out. Scrupulous, remember that means doing the right thing, having scruples. Well, that's going to be Banquo. Ambitious, I think, is both. Loyal, well, it depends how you interpret loyalty, but loyalty to the king, Banquo. Loyalty to his wife, maybe Macbeth. Loyalty to his own ambition, to himself, well, that's Macbeth. Greedy, probably more Macbeth than Banquo. Trusted, well, they're both trusted at different points in the play. Patriotic, you might argue that they both are at the start of the play, but as it develops, Banquo is the more loyal, patriotic character. Macbeth is treacherous. Banquo is more moral. Macbeth is more immoral. Some people might argue he's amoral. He doesn't have any understanding of morals at all. He doesn't know the difference between moral right and immoral wrong. Amorality is a sign of someone who is a psychopath. Heroic, well, depends on your interpretation, but in the eyes of the audience at the time, Banquo. Kingly, well, Macbeth is a king, but he's not very kingly. Banquo shows more qualities of a good king. Selfless, well, that's definitely Banquo. Bewitched is Macbeth. Protective is Banquo. largely, if you think about him being protective of his son, Macbeth is protective of the crown, and that's what kind of undoes him. So that could be both. Malevolent means evil, so that's going to be Macbeth. Noble, well, they're both described as noble. Valiant, the same. Devious, Macbeth. Mendacious, which means lies a lot. Well, that's Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. Brave, up for debate. Admirable, depends on who's saying it, but Duncan admires both of them. They're both generals. They're co-generals in the army. Malleable. Now, this is a sort of scientific word, if you like. If you heat metals, they can become malleable. Plastics are malleable. Basically means you can shape them how you want. That would probably be Macbeth. He's malleable to Lady Macbeth, and he's malleable to the supernatural. They've shaped him how they wanted him. Egotistical, well, probably more Macbeth than Banquo, but maybe a bit of Banquo. Panicked, him when he's going to get killed, but he's got a plan at that stage. Macbeth is much more panicked. Macbeth is much more paranoid, although Banquo obviously fears the death of himself and his son. And guilty, you make that decision. Right, a few other bits and bobs. Macbeth's the protagonist. He's the main character, whereas Banquo is the dramatic foil, which we touched on in a previous lesson. Macbeth is a dynamic character. He changes a lot during the play, arguably, whereas Banquo is more static. He kind of remains the same. Again, these are open to interpretation, so you put them wherever you think is best. Macbeth succumbs to temptation offered by the witches, and Banquo resists it. Macbeth prioritizes his own power and status, whereas Banquo prioritizes the status and potential of his son. In response to the witches, that should be the other way around, actually. That should be on the Banquo side. Whoops. Banquo says he neither begs nor fears the witches. And he's not going to be affected by what they have to say. Whereas Macbeth says, stay you imperfect speakers, and he is rapt with all. So you need to swap those two around. I've got those in the wrong way. Macbeth affected negatively by the witches' prophecies. You could argue that Banquo is too, but I think he's more negatively affected by Macbeth's actions. Right. Macbeth's death leads to a positive change because Scotland is cured of its sickness, whereas Banquo's death is the catalyst for Macbeth's descent into psychopathy, easy for me to say, and Scotland's decline into sickness. So their deaths have different outcomes. Possibly by the end of the play, Macbeth would be despised by King James, whereas Banquo would be admired because he's a distant ancestor, or the real life Banquo was. Symbol of moral weakness, symbol of moral strength, and then some similarities. They're both dead by the end of the play. They are both lionized, which means celebrated as heroic. They are admired by King Duncan, who describes both of them as noble. And in one sense, he's right, and in one sense, he couldn't be more wrong. They do both show signs of suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder in their behaviour, in their hallucinations and their fears. They are both hunted and haunted. So they are both hunted and haunted by each other, actually, and by their doubts and their fears. They both think about killing Duncan, although obviously he acts on it and he represses that desire. And that's it. So we've got a really detailed comparison there of these two characters. And of course, hopefully you've got your own ideas and some of your own quotes maybe added into the mix as well. So remember to submit that to your teacher so they can see everything you've learned about these two characters. Moving on. Okay, again, we're covering a huge amount today, but this is basically a character study of a key character that I'm trying to sort of squeeze into an hour. So again, you can come back to this as and when you want. You don't have to do it all back to back. Banquo's character arc, well, again, this would be something that I'd be looking at if I was targeting grade 7 or above. If I was thinking, I just want to pass English literature, well, you can ignore this and you can crack on. In terms of Banquo's character arc, well, you can read the information on the screen. And as we can see from that illustration, it's basically the journey that a character goes on. So we've got Woody from Toy Story here. They might start in a position where everything's normal and fine, then something good might happen, then he might fall into a metaphorical or literal hole, and things all just seem a bit desperate and a bit sad. And then at that point, he might be dragged out of that hole. Things might start to go right. He could battle his way back to success, and then the story could finish with that moment of success. Or having had that high point, he could just return to a kind of more normal, balanced state, similar to what he was like at the start of the story. Some characters are static. I mentioned that on the previous slide. They don't change, whereas some are dynamic. They change a lot. Now, based on that, there are some questions for you to answer. Is Banquo static or dynamic? Explain. Is Macbeth static or dynamic? Explain. Why might Shakespeare have included both Banquo and Macbeth in the play in terms of putting them side by side as characters? There's some key vocab that you might want to use when answering those questions. And remember, this is really stretch and challenge stuff for grade 7+. And then when you finish that, a challenge and maybe quite a helpful thing for you to do at a later stage, maybe as a revision exercise, is to draw a graph or diagram like this that shows Banquo's character arc and label the key moments that happen along the way. Now, I imagine this might be quite a simple graph to draw, but I won't tell you what you need to do. You can work that out for yourselves. So pause the video and do as many of those tasks now or later as you feel would be beneficial. Right, folks, nearly there. This is the second thing that your teachers are going to want you to submit today, and that's for you to do a brief essay plan in response to the question at the top. Now, the exam style question is write about Banquo and the way he's presented in Macbeth. So in terms of the plan, we're going to start off by just describing who Banquo is and then answering these questions. We might finish our introduction by just saying 3 characteristics that describe Banquo that you're going to go on to explore. So you might say Banquo is moral, he's a symbol of good, and he is protective of his son who might go on to be king. That's just an example. Right, then we say for our next section, so we've got our introduction, next stage of the plan is to say in the early stages of the play, Banquo is, and you're just going to say what Banquo is like at the start of the play in Act 1. Then we're going to just make a list of the following important things that happen that involve Banquo. Now, they don't have to be things that Banquo does himself, but they should all be things related to Banquo. So they can either be things that he does or things that other people do that affect him. Now, try and put those in order that they happen in the play. Now, we're going to say in the closing stages of the play, Banquo's absence. So here we've already written down that Banquo is dead. That's going to happen possibly here. Then we get the idea of Banquo's ghost returning. But then in the closing stages of the play, Banquo is absent completely. The ghost is absent completely as well. And we might just write down here what we think that absence symbolizes. Okay. And then finally, this is your kind of evaluation. So you might look to copy and complete these last 2 sentences. So by constructing this character arc, by building this character development, Shakespeare implies or suggests what? So basically, what's the point of Banquo's character development? And then finally, if that one's tricky, maybe do this one instead, but you can do both. Shakespeare removed Banquo from the play in order to do what? So that's an interesting one. That's thinking without Banquo, what does Macbeth become? Or by killing Banquo, what does Macbeth become? So you're going to want to pause. That's going to take you a good 10-15 minutes to write that essay plan. If you really struggle with it, just let your teacher know, tell them that you had a go but you couldn't do it. But most of you, having watched this carefully, should be able to write a decent essay plan that would, again, be a brilliant revision tool for next year. Okay, pause the video, do your plan. Okay, last two things. As we've done in previous lessons, you might want to update your grid according to these using these terms. So where do you now put them? And finally, you might want to go back to those sentences that we did as the do now, and now just write new sentences or add to the sentences that you wrote, just as a way of summing up your character revision. Again, this is a really good way of revising any characters. So you could do the same thing for Macbeth, for Lady Macbeth. You just basically replace the character's name, and you can use this as a really quick way to sum up a character and the role they play across the whole play. So that's Banquo done. Major character in the play covered in just about an hour. Thanks for all your concentration, your hard work. Remember to use the timestamps if necessary, and remember to get those two tasks, the comparison and the essay plan, into your teachers. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks for listening and watching. See you soon.